Well, welcome to H360 Health Talk. We're here with Kyle Davies today, the author of a new and very exciting book called The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. Kyle is a coach, an author, a trainer. He teaches people on how to optimize their well-being, achieve clarity of mind, and perform more effectively at work, home, and in life. Kyle has spent much of his career pioneering a new approach to treating chronic fatigue and pain, anxiety, and depression. Great book, The Intelligent Body. He also works with individuals and businesses to help them better understand themselves and reach their full potential. Kyle, welcome. We're glad to see you. And the book, great achievement here, The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. Why don't we start by having you give us a little background on how you got into the whole chronic fatigue and your approach to treating this from the inside out, as your book suggests.
Okay, so I'm a psychologist by original trade. I worked in business consulting for about 10 years. I do a whole range of things, really. The thing that interested me most was coaching. But one of the things I kind of found in business was that people would wear a mask. So in business coaching, it was dealing with the person in the role. Looking at their skills, their behaviours, how to make them more effective at work. And I just had this feeling that I wanted to get a bit deeper. There was more to that person than the manager that I was seeing. So I went and trained in a whole series of therapies, and I started a little practice. I was then introduced to a GP, a general practitioner, doctor over here in the UK. He'd done some of the same sorts of training that I'd done. And he had a particular interest in chronic fatigue syndrome because his girlfriend had it, and he was kind of deeply frustrated that as a doctor there was nothing that he could do. So he started to kind of tweak some of the stuff that he'd learned, and he'd found that he was beginning to make a difference. So I was introduced to him. We started to work together. At the time, there was absolutely nothing else available, either in mainstream or outside of mainstream, that was claiming to be able to make any real difference for people with fatigue and pain type issues. So we thought, this is amazing. We've got something here. It's not complete, but we've got something that seems to be working. So we trained practitioners. We tried to get research done. That was unbelievably hard, and we failed. And it's a kind of an interesting thing, really. If you're trying to put forward a new idea, especially a therapy, and have it embraced within mainstream healthcare, you come up against all sorts of barriers. That's probably no surprise at all. So my GP business partner got a bit jaded because he just wanted to help people. He wasn't particularly interested in business, and of course we were existing as a business. So he went back to being a GP. I've continued to kind of fly the flag. I've evolved the process, and then I've now written this book, really just in an attempt to get the word out. It feels to me like the tide is turning, and there's beginning to be a greater acceptance of the sorts of ideas that I talk about in the book. Yeah. So that's the kind of the background of how I got where I am.
Yeah.
And one of the ideas that you talk about in the book is the relationship between your emotions and your health and well-being. And something that we hear a lot about here at Healthio 360 is the role of positivity and positive thinking in your ability to recover when you're living with a chronic illness. Can you tell us a little more about this concept and how your understanding of it can lead to recovery?
Okay, now that's a big question. Yeah. So emotion and stress, in my mind, are linked. So if I can talk a little bit about stress to start with. For me, our emotional stress can lead and directly cause physical illness. So I think that, it's a big statement, but I think we're beginning to see that it's a true statement. I think there are two crucial things about stress that probably often not really viewed. And I think people often think that stress is that agitated feeling that they have. I've had a stressful day at the office. Whereas really, I would say that's an emotional feeling that somebody has, and the fact that they're aware of it means they can do something about it. The two really important things about stress, as far as I'm concerned, which bring mind and body together as one, is that firstly, our body can be in a state of stress without just being aware of it. So we should be aware of that in order to do something about it. Well, ideally, that would be the case. But it's the case that often we're not. I remember some years ago reading what I thought was a great book called Healing Without Prozac and Freud by a psychiatrist called Dr. David Schreiber. And in the book, he talks about some research that he was doing where he was really looking at the activity of the brain, blood pressure, heart rate, these sorts of things, while putting people under stress. Now, the method he used for putting people under stress was showing them some disturbing films. And he talks about this kind of bit in the book where he's saying that he had this lady in the lab, she's watching this disturbing film, and he's looking at the heart rate, of blood pressure, and the activity of the brain, and they're all kind of sky high. So blood pressure's going mad, her heart rate's going crazy, her brain's kind of going bonkers. And he's thinking, oh my God, this lady's in a deep state of stress. So he goes into the lab and he says to her, are you okay? Do you want me to turn this off? And she looks at him with this element of surprise and says, oh, I'm perfectly fine. I'm quite happy watching this. So that was a person that was, as I would say, is kind of locked in their head. So cut off from the body, cut off from feeling. So he's completely unaware that her body is in a deep state of stress. Now, I would also say that that's a person that if she goes through life like that, at some point, if she's experiencing a lot of low-grade stresses, which many people are in life, there's a very good chance that her body could be stuck in the stress response, which over time will lead to it breaking down and then some form of disease. So that's the first thing. I think the second very important point about stress is that we can have a physical injury, we can have an illness, we can have a bad diet, we can ingest toxins, we can have a buildup of emotion, and the stress response in the body is exactly the same. And that, as I say, that brings mind and body together as well. So you could have a car accident, you could have a bad case of flu, you could lose a job, and the stress response that's triggered is the same. So again, a lot of people think of stress as something that's in their mind, a mental thing. Whereas in actual fact, it's a full body experience. So when it comes to emotion, again, often people think that emotion is something that's all in the mind. People think that emotion is the end result of thinking. And what neuroscience is telling us is that, well, that's old-fashioned. So whilst we know it's possible to change our emotion through thinking, it's very limited because in actual fact, our emotion affects our thinking more than our thinking affects our emotion. So emotion is initially triggered. We have neurons in our heart, we have neurons in our gut, so thus we have like gut feelings. So a combination of the heart, the gut, and the non-thinking part of the brain, or the midbrain, that's what results in emotion. And then when emotion is triggered throughout the body and brain, the thinking centers become active. So there's a greater flow of information from the heart to the brain than there is from the brain to the heart. And there's a far greater flow from the non-thinking part of the brain to the thinking part than there is the other way around. So we've seen for many years now, 20 odd years, that there's been an entire field that's based on the idea that change the way you think, change the way you feel. And it does work to a certain extent, but my experience of working with people with chronic illness is it doesn't work. So if you're just a bit miserable in your life, you could probably think some happy thoughts and make yourself feel a bit better. It's a lot of hard work and you have to keep doing it. But in my mind, it's the wrong way to go, because I think ultimately thinking just leads to more thinking, and if you're in a bad mood, you'll probably end up just thinking, and that in my experience, that kind of just gets worse. Yeah. But when it comes to actual symptoms, if you're suffering from migraines, headaches, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, stomach and bowel complaints, thinking will not shift your symptoms, and I think that's because emotion affects thinking more than thinking affects our emotion. So that's the kind of view of emotion. There's another little bit with that in terms of theory, which is that emotion is a non-conscious process that triggers feeling. So often people think emotion and feeling are the same thing. And looking at what goes on in the brain, apparently emotion and feeling is slightly different. So the fact that emotion is non-conscious means that it's there and it's being sent, it's being produced, it's being triggered. But if we don't feel it, we know that we can block feelings. So, and this is what we do. We do it consciously, we do it unconsciously, we resist. So we can block our feelings, but we can't block the emotion that's going on underneath. So when it comes to the production of symptoms, essentially what happens is that when feelings are blocked, the body doesn't stop sending emotion, but the body and brain then think that, well, something is wrong, because if we feel our feelings, we can do something about them. If we block them and the emotion is getting pumped, then the body responds as if there's something wrong. So that was a long answer to your question, isn't it?
So Kyle, I want to get back to a word that you've used a couple of times now, and you refer to mainstream. So when we talk about chronic fatigue and we talk about fibromyalgia, there are many doctors out there that would say, well, that's fibromyalgia especially is not a real diagnosis, right? It could be misdiagnosed, it could be depression, it could be other things. But you talk to a patient who says they suffer from fibromyalgia, and it's some patients that we've talked to, it's really debilitating. So where's the medical community in this? I mean, and when you see and you talk to patients with chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, do a lot of them say to you, gosh, I think, I went to see my doctor and, I think I'm misdiagnosed, or you say, geez, you're displaying these symptoms that you talk about the mind and the body and emotions, but yet the person says, well, I've walked out of there with a diagnosis of depression and I've been put on this medication to treat that. What do you say about that?
Okay, so my view is very simplistic in a way. I think that anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, these are umbrella terms for what can be a diverse range of symptoms. And I suppose I believe that, going back to this idea of stress, the metaphor that I use with the people that I work with is I say, well, we have a stress bucket inside of us. And I don't think, therefore, there's a single primary cause. I think there's a multiple range of causes. It's almost like a combination lock. So as that stress bucket gets full with a variety of things, which could be, so for example, last year I had 2 clients that came to me with fibro, and they said to me, my fibromyalgia has been caused by a car accident. And just as I was saying earlier, a car accident, that will trigger the stress response in the body. Now, I view that as a person with a pretty full stress bucket. The car accident has just filled the stress bucket to the limit, and then they've exhibited symptoms. Now, it's a very simplistic way of looking at it. Now, why does one person get depression, one person get chronic fatigue? I'm not sure I can answer that. It's probably due to their genetics, their natural wiring. One thing I would say, though, is that everyone that I've worked with chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia will have, at some stage earlier in their life, experienced some milder symptoms. So my perspective is this, that the body works in a way that it's trying to get our attention. And if we look at a full stress bucket as being as the body then needs to try to get our attention, it's going to shout at us in some way with symptoms. So my view is that our body uses emotion as a way of giving us feedback. So I think emotion is a kind of feedback mechanism about our interaction with our environment, in exactly the same way as if when you're hungry, how do you know you're hungry? Well, I feel a rumbling, sensation. Now, of course, that rumbling will come and then it'll go and then it'll come back. And if you don't eat for a long time, 3, 4, 5 days, then you don't get a mild rumbling anymore. What you get is something more intense. So the body, it's almost as if the body will crank up the volume of the symptoms that it sends over time. But interestingly, the message behind that symptom is still exactly the same. So I've experienced this with people with CFS, fibro, and those sorts of things, is that everyone starts off with some mild symptoms. It could be headaches, it could be a bad stomach, it could be problems sleeping, anxiety, low mood. It always starts with a little bit of that. And either those symptoms just naturally subside, or they do something, they take some meds or they take some pills or potions, whatever, to try to get rid of those symptoms. What they find is the symptoms come back, and they're either more intense or they've morphed into something else. and eventually they come back as full-blown CFS or fibro. So in terms of, I suppose I have a very different view of medicine, as you can probably tell. Medicine is categorizing us. And at one level, it's useful for a person to know, all right, well, this is what's going on with me. But for the most part, the diagnoses that people are receiving are just a label over a cluster of symptoms. And it may be that medicine knows what's going on, but it may be, as is in the case of chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, that medicine doesn't exactly know what's going on, because they're diagnosed through exclusion. So people have a series of blood tests, the blood tests don't show up anything. So if their symptoms persist after a period of time, they're offered a diagnosis which could be post-viral fatigue, chronic fatigue, chronic immunodeficiency syndrome, or fibromyalgia. And that will generally depend on what preceded those symptoms and what the main symptoms are. So with fibromyalgia, it tends to be pain symptoms, and there are certain pain points that people have.
Yeah.
Whereas chronic fatigue, the main symptom is fatigue, but there is huge overlap. There's fatigue, there's pain, there's brain fog, there's flu-like symptoms. So there's a whole cluster of symptoms.
Yeah, got it.
That's kind of the difference, if that makes sense.
So one of the big things you talk about in your book, The Intelligent Body, is this concept called energy flow coaching. Can you kind of take us through that coaching process, and what are some of the scientific theories that it draws from?
So I guess when it comes to the health stuff, the main bit of science is the work of Dr. Hans Selye, and that's going back. He's the godfather of stress, going back to the kind of 1920s and 30s. So that's the idea that a body in a perpetual state of stress eventually breaks down. I also draw on the work of Milton Erickson, the hypnotherapist, because his view was a symptom is purposeful. So the symptom is trying to tell you something. So those, I guess, there's science there. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio is the guy that talked about emotion and feeling being different things. So there are a whole load of theories that I pull into the work. In terms of a process, it's about empowerment. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm inviting people to entertain this idea, right, well, your body is producing a symptom. It's not that symptom is necessarily some evil invader. It's your body's trying to tell you something. So I'm assuming that it's this buildup of emotional stress predominantly. There may be other stresses, but predominantly emotional stress in that stress bucket. So I kind of work that through, but it's giving people a new understanding of